Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Drug Development and Approval in the U.S., Regulatory Challenges and Opportunities for Cannabis Therapies, presented by Emily Leongini, an attorney at Arent Fox. I am Judy O'Rourke of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this educational web seminar presented by LabRoots. LabRoots is the leading scientific social networking website and producer of educational virtual events and webinars. Before I begin, I'd like to remind everyone this event is interactive. We encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. Just click on the Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen and type your questions into the drop-down box that appears on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. If you have trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please click on the Help Desk button located in the promotional board at the bottom center of your screen, or use the Ask a Question box to let us know that you're having a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located in the top right corner of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. Please join me in welcoming Emily Leongini. I will now turn the presentation over to her.
Thank you so much, Judy. As Judy mentioned, my name is Emily Leongini, and I'm an attorney at the DC-based law firm of Arent Fox. I'm an FDA regulatory attorney by training, and I joined the firm after working at the FDA for about 6 years. And I am delighted to be joining you here today to talk about the FDA drug approval paradigm and what that might mean in the cannabis industry. And hopefully after our presentation today, you'll be able to have an understanding of how FDA regulates drugs and some other kinds of products, and understanding how cannabis therapies may and may not fit it within that regulatory paradigm. So as a preliminary matter, I think it'd be helpful just to talk about what it is that the FDA does. Obviously, I think folks know about the regulation of foods and drugs, because that's in the title of the agency. But the FDA also has a very wide-ranging regulatory jurisdiction over a lot of different kinds of products, everything from foods and drugs, medical devices, to veterinary medicines and foods, and my personal favorite fun fact, laser pointers that cats use. So they have a lot of different things that the FDA regulates, and the kinds of controls that the FDA imposes on those various different categories is determined by what kind of product it is under the definitions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And as I'll mention in just a moment, how the product is regulated and what kind of regulatory bucket it falls within is determined by what the product's, quote, intended use is. So, but before we get to that, I just wanted to mention FDA's role in regulating cannabis. The FDA obviously oversees the drug approval paradigm and the drug approval pathway for any kind of pharmaceutical, including potential cannabis therapies. Additionally, FDA provides scientific support and oversight by conducting literature and scientific reviews to support or make recommendations to the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Department of Health and Human Services, within which the FDA sits, regarding scheduling determinations. As you all are likely aware, in the summer of 2016, DEA recently, denied a petition to reschedule marijuana from a Schedule I drug to potentially a lower schedule. And part of the DEA's determination, their rationale for making that determination, was based on input and guidance from the FDA reviewing the available scientific literature. Additionally, from the scientific role, FDA also oversees many of the clinical trials and clinical research that are conducted with cannabis therapies. And additionally, the FDA takes enforcement action. It's been in the form of sending warning letters to companies that have been marketing cannabis therapies with some fairly egregious kinds of health claims. And you'll understand why. If you don't already, you'll understand why that's an issue momentarily once we start getting into some of the definitions. So there are a lot of different definitions within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but for the purposes of our talk today, two of the ones that I wanted to discuss are the definitions of drug and dietary supplement, because these are two definitions that I think people are there's a lot of confusion about, and where that line between a dietary supplement and a drug, where that line is. So a dietary supplement is a product that contains a vitamin, mineral, herb, other botanical, or any other kind of dietary substance that is intended to, see, we're getting back to that intended language, intended to supplement the diet. And of key importance here is that a dietary supplement cannot contain an FDA-approved drug or a drug that is currently under investigation for which there's scientific literature is publicly available. So if something that would otherwise be regulated or could be regulated as a dietary supplement contains a substance that is currently under investigation for use in a drug, that product is automatically excluded from the statutory definition of dietary supplement as it's defined under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So moving along to drug, the way that this is kind of a partial definition of drug, but it's most relevant for our purposes here today. A drug is defined as articles that are, again, intended for the use in diagnosing, curing, mitigating, treating, or preventing a disease. It also includes articles other than food that are intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So a couple of important distinctions between dietary supplements and drugs are the statute that created the regulatory classification of dietary supplement, very interestingly placed them as kind of a subclass of foods. So as I mentioned earlier, the way and the types of regulatory controls that the FDA imposes on a particular product are driven by what bucket it falls under. And the way that the enabling legislation, it's called DSHEA or DSHEA, depending on who you ask, passed in 1994, put dietary supplements within the food bucket. So along with that, there's no pre-market approval. There are different kinds of manufacturing and production requirements, different kinds of registration requirements. So it's very different than the way that FDA regulates drugs, which is what we'll be spending most of our time today talking about. Then another one of the key distinctions, and this again is based on the way that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act defines these types of products, is that if a product that would otherwise or could otherwise be considered to be a dietary supplement makes claims on the labeling, and labeling is not just what appears on the bottle of a product. It includes practically anything you say about the product. So it includes information on a website, testimonials, all those things. So labeling is defined very, very broadly. And so if any of the labeling contains any representations or claims that the product is intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, prevent, or treat a disease, it de facto, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, becomes a drug. Even if nothing else changes, if just what you say about the product is that it is going to prevent a disease or treat a disease, and again, disease is construed very, very broadly as well. then it automatically becomes a drug. And that's where a lot of cannabis companies have gotten into some hot water in the past. When I mentioned the enforcement, those were the kinds of things, it was those claims that rendered the products drugs and therefore unlawfully marketed. So moving along to the bulk of our presentation today, we're going to be talking about FDA's regulatory paradigm for approving drugs. So there are a number of different ways that a drug can be lawfully marketed in the United States. There are over-the-counter drugs, which essentially have to comply with, they're kind of like recipes that FDA has issued, and they're all codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And it states what kind of active ingredients are allowed to be used, what kinds of information has to be on the label, what kind of combinations of active products can be used. But if a product complies with those quote unquote recipes, also called monographs, an OTC drug may be lawfully marketed over the counter. Then in terms of the products that have to go through an approval process with the FDA, the one that we'll be talking about primarily today is the new drug application, or NDA, approval process. And that requires extensive safety and efficacy data to support FDA approval. There are also something called the 505(b)(2) or paper NDA product. It's also technically a new drug application, but instead of relying upon all that extensive clinical data, it relies upon the published literature and previous findings by FDA of safety and efficacy of another approved drug in that same class or that similar drug. So because they rely, instead of on clinical data, they're relying upon paper. That's why it's called the paper NDA. And then there's also the abbreviated new drug application process, and that is a process that is used for generic drugs. So referencing what's called an innovator drug, the drug that was approved under an NDA, the sponsor of an ANDA or ANDA does not need to replicate all of the clinical trials that were used to support the initial marketing in the NDA, but instead they just have to demonstrate that their product is bioequivalent to, basically that it interacts in the same way in the body and gives the same clinical benefit as the innovator drug that was approved under the NDA. So we're going to be talking primarily about the NDA process because it's new drug applications, and I think that's what's most applicable likely in the cannabis space. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So some facts about the approval of new drug applications. According to FDA's estimation, it takes about anywhere between 8 and 10 years following preclinical work to do the requisite studying and clinical research that is necessary to demonstrate that a drug is safe and effective to be approved by the FDA. And so as this slide mentioned, that includes some early lab testing as well as animal testing. And then much of it involves the clinical trials with human subjects. So this is a graphic describing that portrays the process for how a drug application proceeds through the FDA approval process. So of course, begins with preclinical, meaning not in human subject types of research, followed by meetings with the FDA to basically scope out the investigational new drug application, followed by clinical trials, and then the submission of the new drug application. And then for the lucky few who make it through that far, the FDA approval. So we're going to be going through each of these stages in a little bit more detail. So with the investigational new drug application, essentially it is intended for any drug that you want to study in humans, and that you want to market as a drug, meaning you want to market it as being intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, prevent a disease, before initiating clinical trials, you need to submit and have approved an investigational new drug application, or an IND. And so the IND is the culmination of a successful preclinical development, meaning all of the testing that was done leading up to human clinical trials. And it's the vehicle through which sponsors obtain FDA approval to begin the clinical research with the drug. So one of the things to mention is that FDA is, they're pretty emphatic, and it also behooves the sponsors that that companies should interact early, frequently, and regularly with the FDA as they are going through the drug approval process. So talking about the IND, at the IND stage, there are something called the pre-IND meetings, which, as you would imagine, involves meeting with the FDA before you submit the IND to basically reach an agreement with the agency about the format of the IND. And at that point, FDA will request any additional information that they might want, talk about the kind of clinical testing that needs to happen, to discuss the product characterization issues and the scope and the design of the phase 1 clinical trials. So I've been using the term sponsor and using some of these terminologies. So just to kind of clarify what I mean here. So these are some of the players in this process. The sponsor is, in FDA language, that's the company that is, technically it could be just a person, but typically a company that is responsible for and initiates the clinical investigation with the drug. Then the investigator is the individual who actually conducts the clinical investigations. Contract research organizations, or CROs, most companies don't actually do their clinical trials in-house. They will contract with organizations that have expertise in this area, and have done this many, many times before. And so they in fact, most times, sponsors will outsource the conduct of the clinical trials to a CRO. Additionally, there are institutional review boards, or IRBs, which is the independent body that is set up to evaluate and review clinical studies, paying particular attention to protection of the human subjects, making sure that there's informed consent, making sure that the clinical trials are being run appropriately. Then the term subject is the term that is used for the individual who is participating in the clinical trials. And then, of course, there's the FDA that oversees all of it. So the sponsors, investigators, CROs, and IRBs are all subject to FDA inspection after the IND has been filed. Not only are they subject to inspection, but they are inspected almost all the time. And not only can failure to comply with FDA's IND and clinical research requirements, not only can that end up receiving a warning letter, but if there are some major issues that FDA finds, they can either place a clinical hold on that study, or also they could prevent future applications for other drugs from moving forward if the deficiency is serious enough. So what actually goes into an IND? I'm not going to run through all of these things, but a few things to highlight. Of course, there's the background information on the sponsor and about the drug. But of great importance are the study protocols. And I'll on the next slide, we'll talk about exactly what the study protocols are. But it's basically how the company plans to run its clinical trials. In addition, FDA requires that sponsors submit what are called CMCs, the chemistry, manufacturing, and control information. This is essentially how the active ingredient is being manufactured. And the active ingredient meaning the ingredient that produces the drug effect of the intended effect of the drug. And then the drug product itself, meaning the total drug product. Additionally, labeling for investigational new drugs, there's certain specific labeling requirements, basically saying this is for investigational use only. And then in addition, as part of the submission, sponsors are required to submit pharmacology and toxicology information, data that was collected during the preclinical phase. And then if there's any other previous human experience with the drug, that should also be submitted. So the study protocols, which are pretty key in getting an IND approved, of course, you have to say what your point is, what your goal is, and how you're going to measure it. So the objectives of the study and the primary and secondary endpoints. How are you going to determine whether the product is both safe and effective for the intended indication? Measures that are intended to monitor the not only the effectiveness, but also the safety in humans, as well as the proposed statistical analysis that the sponsor plans to use in evaluating the drug's safety and efficacy. So after FDA has approved an IND, you can't just go ahead and get started with the clinical trials. You have to wait 30 days before initiating the clinical trials. And there's oftentimes FDA asks for changes, tweaks, and that can sometimes cause some delays. Sometimes folks have to go back to the drawing board. And again, this underscores the importance of having those pre-IND meetings to work with FDA proactively to identify any potential hiccups before you get too far down the road and end up submitting your IND, and then FDA asks for changes thereafterwards. So FDA can issue a clinical hold on any sort of proposed or ongoing clinical trials. As I mentioned, for if there's any new data that is discovered, any potential safety concerns, and as well as I mentioned earlier, if any of the investigations by FDA reveal any major deficiencies as well. And there is a very strict prohibition against advertising or promoting in any way an investigational new drug. So moving right along, so once an IND is approved, we get to hop to clinical trials. And so there are there are typically 3 phases of clinical trials, although sometimes, and this is something that can be worked out during the IND phase, sometimes the different phases can be combined: phase 1, phase 2, phase 2, phase 3. But again, it depends on the drug and it depends on the particular study proposed. And so as listed here, phase 1, very, very small number of humans participating in those trials. Phase 2, you move it up a little bit to a few hundred. And then phase 3 is where it sort of becomes used more broadly, and it's usually in the thousands of clinical subjects. So the whole purpose of phase 1 studies it's the first time that it's been used in humans, and it is intended to figure out how the drug is metabolized, what the pharmacological actions of the drugs are in humans. They might or might not be different than they were during the animal testing phase. This is the phase at which sponsors begin to identify the potential side effects of the drugs, and as well as determining the mechanism of action, or MOA, how the drug works in humans. And this phase, it's not the point of this phase is really intended to kind of figure out what the safety profile is, but it's also an opportunity to gain early evidence on the effectiveness or the efficacy of the drug. So then once phase 1 studies have been completed, as I mentioned, it gets rolled out to more individuals. More individuals test the drug. This is the point at which the efficacy really starts to be studied, and you start determining, the sponsor starts collecting data on the extent to which the drug is effective. And this is also the point at which start to kind of fine tune what the particular indication for the drug is. And one thing, and we'll get to this in a moment, but when FDA approves a drug, it is approved for a specific indication and usually within a specific population of patients. And so this is where it's in the phase 2 trials that you start figuring out exactly who it is beneficial to treat and what are the particular indications are that it can be used to treat. This is also the phase at which short-term side effects and certain risks begin to be evaluated. And as the slide notes, these studies are usually well controlled and they're very closely monitored. And assuming successful completion of phase 2 trials, you'll move right along to phase 3. Again, start enrolling far more subjects into these trials, and usually in the thousands. These are well-controlled studies. They're almost always blinded or double-blinded clinical trials. And as mentioned here, they are performed after there's been evidence gathered during the phase 2 trials that suggests the effectiveness as well as safety of the drug. And this is where it's intended to evaluate the overall benefit risk profile of the drug, which is one of the big factors the FDA takes into consideration when determining whether or not to approve a drug. And also, as the specific indication is fine-tuned, this is when you start to prepare the adequate labeling of the drug and the specific indication that it's going to be approved to treat. And this is also the phase at which many people start considering what the potential Medicare, Medicaid reimbursement profile would be for the particular drug. So assuming a sponsor and a drug makes it all the way through these various phases, and not a whole lot of drugs do, but assuming that all of these phases have been successfully completed to FDA satisfaction, then the next phase is submitting the actual new drug application. So these applications are huge, like tens of thousands of pages. And so this is the opportunity at which hopefully the sponsor will have been engaging FDA throughout the process and will have had a pre-NDA meeting like they did before they submitted their IND to figure out how to best package the information and to address any issues that FDA might flag at that point. But the actual contents of the application it's all of the clinical data that was developed during all the phase 1 through 3 testing, as well as any literature references and any other scientific information. Again, the CMC information about how the drug is manufactured and produced. And FDA will go out and inspect before approving a drug, the FDA will inspect the facilities that are producing the drug to make sure that it complies with FDA's good manufacturing or GMP standards. Once the NDA has been submitted, the FDA has 60 days within which it can determine whether or not it wants to, quote, file the application. And at that point, they can either file it, meaning basically accepting the application for official review, or they can refuse to file if there's a deficiency. Obviously, if there's some big section of the application that's missing, that would constitute a refuse to file, something that would cause the FDA to refuse to file the application. But there are other potential concerns that could also lead FDA to refuse to file the application. Assuming that the FDA does in fact file it, the standard time frame in which FDA will, their goal for reviewing the application is 10 months and giving an approval decision within that 10 months. I'll talk about this in shortly. There's also a priority review option for certain kinds of drugs that are intended to meet an unmet medical need. Those that can be eligible for a priority review or 6-month review. And one of the ways that FDA can guarantee that it meets these timeframes is that the timeframes are supported in large part by user fees that are paid by the industry. So a long time ago, well, I guess people still probably complain about the FDA review process and approval times. However, back in the early 1990s, the drug industry had just been so fed up with the long wait times, felt like it was a black box that, black hole. They'd submit their applications and then not hear anything or not have any sort of significant interaction. And so the industry proposed, well, how about, because in part FDA's position was, look, we don't have enough people to review the drug applications. And so the industry's response was, well, how about if we give you money? Will that solve the problem? And so back in the mid 90s, the very first user fee legislation was passed for prescription drugs. And it's a lot of money. So this year, I think the filing fee for new drug applications that contain clinical data, the user fees, i.e. the fee that you're required to pay when you submit your application, was around $2.4 million. And then for those paper NDAs that don't require the clinical data, that was more in the range of about $1.5 million. So it's nothing to sneeze at. But the exchange for those hefty fees is having predictability in the review time, as well as having predictability in terms of getting meetings with the FDA throughout the review to help speed up the development and approval process. So one other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that as part of the FDA approval process, there are also maybe, but are not necessarily, there are advisory committees who will review the proposed drug and opine on whether or not they believe the risk-benefit ratio, profile is sufficient to support approval. The advisory committee doesn't have an official say in whether or not FDA approves a drug. However, they will, oftentimes their recommendations are what the FDA ultimately adopts. So moving along. So when FDA finally approves the drug after these, decade plus long process, wanted to mention that it's not just the drug that FDA is approving. There are conditions, a number of other conditions that come along with FDA approval. So as part of the FDA approval process, I mentioned that the FDA will inspect the facilities that are being used to manufacture and produce the drug. And so there's a little asterisk here next to manufacturing facilities. That's because FDA doesn't actually approve facilities. So if you ever see somebody say that they are marketing an FDA, that they have an FDA approved or an FDA certified manufacturing facility, run for the hills, because they either don't know what they're talking about or they're blowing smoke, because there's no such thing as an FDA approved facility. However, as I mentioned, FDA does inspect and to ensure that the facilities are in compliance with FDA's good manufacturing practice requirements before they will approve a drug. Additionally, FDA reviews and approves proposed names of the drug. So one of the things that FDA does is ensure that the proposed name is not confusingly similar to a drug that's already being marketed, or is not misleading in any sort of way. For example, FDA would never allow you to say, name a drug, cancer cures, or something to that effect. It can't be fanciful or include any information that could be perceived as misleading. Another thing that FDA approves is the labeling for the drug. So for prescription drugs, there are what are called package inserts. And so that's, I'm sure probably of all, if you've had a prescription drug and there's a wadded up piece of paper in the box or next to the pill bottle that has a lot of information that you've probably never read. Well, take a look at it the next time. All of that is information that is carefully negotiated with FDA during the approval process, and FDA approves all of the information that is included in that as part of the drug approval process. FDA will also, for most of the time, it doesn't require approving the promotional materials, but it's all smart companies will submit their promotional materials to have FDA review and approve them to make sure they're in compliance with FDA's very stringent drug promotional requirements. So in addition, once you've gone through all of this, you're not off the hook yet. There's a wide range of post-market or post-approval requirements that drug manufacturers are required to comply with. So mentioned that the facilities that manufacture the drug are approved before the drug is approved. Well, they are also routinely inspected to make sure that the GMPs are continuing to be followed. Historically, that happened every 2 or so years. Now FDA has pivoted more to a risk-based model. So for either facilities that have been out of compliance or market higher risk, or manufacture higher risk drugs, FDA might inspect those facilities more frequently. And use its limited resources to focus on the bad actors or the higher risk types of drugs. In addition, drug sponsors for approved NDAs are required to report adverse events, very strict reporting requirements regarding adverse events of which they become aware, and there's obligations to monitor literature for potential adverse events and report those to FDA. Some of the more serious ones have to be reported within a 2-week time frame. So there's a lot of companies will have, or they should have, a very robust pharmacovigilance plan in place. And then as well, if there are any sorts of changes that the sponsor wants to make to the drug, either if the sponsor is interested in marketing the product for additional indications, if they've started gathering research to support the use in additional populations or for other uses, that would require submitting a supplement to the NDA to receive FDA approval for those additional indications. It also covers labeling. Sometimes FDA will require changes to the labeling based on adverse event reports. If there's new information that it receives or the sponsor receives that FDA believes should be included on the package insert or in the labeling, FDA can also request those kinds of changes. And additionally, if you change your suppliers, or the manufacturing processes. Those will often require either prior approval or prior notification to the agency of those kinds of changes. So you're thinking, wow, this is great. This is a lot of terrific information, but I'm here to learn about cannabis. So what does all this mean in the cannabis space? One of the points that I wanted to make was I want you all to understand how FDA regulates drugs. This is based on the paradigm that was given to the FDA by Congress through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And there's a lot of ways in which cannabis and cannabis-derived medical uses and therapies don't really quite fit in to the FDA's existing paradigm, but that's not to say that they can't or don't. So FDA is very keenly aware that cannabis holds a lot of promise for treatment of a number of different conditions. However, there are no FDA-approved drugs that contain a plant-derived cannabinoid, obviously cannabis itself is not approved by the FDA for medical use, nor is any plant-derived therapy. So it's not been approved for any indication. You'll see I use the word marijuana here because this is FDA references the Controlled Substances Act, which schedules marijuana. But this would be the same for there's no currently approved marketing applications that are derived from industrial hemp either. There are a number of three different NDAs approved, and then one ANDA that are approved for kind of synthetic versions, synthetic cannabis. These are all kind of THC, synthetic THC, or a chemical compound related to THC, and it's the drugs are Marinol. That was the one that was approved back in the 80s, I believe. And subsequent to that, there have been approvals for Syndros and Sesamet, and then most recently Syndros. And FDA's position, and this is one of the reasons that it recommended to DEA, or as part of its review of clinical data and existing scientific research, as requested by DEA in response to the petition to reschedule marijuana. FDA did not believe that there is sufficient clinical, well-controlled studies that have been conducted, or at least not when they reviewed the evidence several years ago, that would support rescheduling. And so although FDA understands that there are great potentials for cannabis therapies, today, their position is we just need more data. So a few things about you conducting research with cannabis. It's not just the FDA that gets involved. Of course, there's always the DEA, and the DEA, this would happen for any kind of controlled substance, not just cannabis, but also any kind of controlled substance. The DEA, the individuals, so the investigators and the CRO, the people that are conducting the research, need to register and be inspected by the DEA to be approved. To essentially, their concern is more about preventing diversion into the black or gray market. So there would be DEAs involved with approving the facilities and the investigators that handle the cannabis. And there's also the registration of the protocol itself. So remember many slides ago when we were talking about the study protocol, DEA is also involved in reviewing that to make sure that it complies with all DEA requirements. And so then there are additional for any kind of Schedule I research that's happening. There are additional very stringent anti-diversion requirements that are in place. Crazy locks and security and steel cages and the like, very strict controls over who is allowed to have access to the Schedule I substance and the like. And so as the IND, during the IND development phase, before the clinical research can happen, the DEA also has to weigh in and approve those individuals to possess and administer the controlled substance. As well, when it comes to, this is one area where cannabis is very unique. There is only one place in the United States, the University of Mississippi, that grows, quote, research grade marijuana for clinical use in the United States. And so in addition to getting FDA approval of your IND and getting DEA approval of the investigators and the research sites, you'd also need to figure out where to get the cannabis. And for clinical trials conducted in the United States, NIDA, through a contract with the University of Mississippi, is the only entity that is lawfully able to provide marijuana for clinical research. Now, that's in the United States. It's a little bit different analysis when it's outside the United States, but my understanding is that there have been individuals who want to study cannabis, gone through all the FDA approval, gone through the DEA approval, and then they've just been waiting on NIDA to provide the particular strain, strength, and dosage form of the cannabis for their use. And I've also remember reading a Washington Post article maybe last year that was basically questioning the quality of the cannabis, and also noted that it had certain pesticide residues and certain mold content. But that is where one can lawfully obtain research grade cannabis in the United States. So kind of looping back to the FDA piece of the puzzle. So I mentioned that FDA understands and is aware of the potential therapeutic use for cannabis. FDA has stated that it is doing everything within its existing regulatory paradigm to help encourage scientifically valid research in this space. So some of the examples that they've given of how they have been supporting cannabis research that goes through the FDA, it has to go through the FDA approval process. FDA revised and then finalized a guidance on using botanicals as the source of drugs. And the primary focus of that is figuring out how to produce consistent and reproducible quantities of the drug product for use in supporting the drug application. In addition, FDA has stated that it has been working with sponsors and potential sponsors on helping them identify and use some of the available existing tools that FDA has at its disposal to help speed drug development. And these include orphan disease designation, which is for drugs that are intended to treat very, very, very small diseases that affect very, very small numbers of people. There's also priority review that is available for, again, for some unmet drugs that are intended to treat an unmet medical need, as well as various other sundry categories, including neglected tropical diseases and drugs intended for medical countermeasures. and the like. And then FDA has also stated that they are really taking efforts to appropriately staff their botanical drugs team and make them available, and with interactions with sponsors and potential sponsors and companies that are interested in pursuing FDA approval for potential cannabis, for potential approval. And so FDA is taken the position that they are using all of the tools that are at their disposal currently to help companies that want to go through the FDA drug approval process, to give them the resources that they need to basically play by FDA's rules. So I have mentioned, kind of alluded to this process earlier, but just to walk you through how research would be conducted with marijuana. So the first step would be to contact FDA. Again, frequent interaction with the FDA is critical in ensuring a successful application, and I think just also a less frustrating process. So contacting the FDA, obtaining a pre-IND number from the FDA, taking that to NIDA, it says, or another DEA registered source here on this screen. And so the NIDA, the University of Mississippi, is not it's not written in law that it holds a monopoly on it. It just de facto does at the present time. DEA has stated that it is has been accepting applications for additional growers who want to grow and provide research grade cannabis for use in human research. But to my knowledge, there have been no other sites approved. So although it says here another DEA approved source, for right now it's just NIDA. And so this goes back to the CMC information, basically wanting to make sure that the drug that's being studied satisfies all of FDA's good manufacturing practice requirements. And then after that step, the next step would be to contact the DEA to become appropriately registered and for the appropriate licensure as a Schedule I researcher. And then if applicable, and isn't always, the sponsor would obtain from NIDA a letter of authorization to reference the NIDA's good manufacturing practices. So they kind of incorporate how NIDA does it, and they'll say that's how we're going to make sure the product is being appropriately manufactured, is by reference to NIDA's standards. And then the sponsor would submit the IND protocol, including that letter of authorization, if applicable, to both the FDA and DEA. FDA would review that IND in accordance with the process and steps that I described earlier. And then the sponsor, after that, step number 7, if you're still with me here, the sponsor would contact NIDA or the other source to obtain the marijuana for use in the clinical trials. And so there are multiple steps involved here that are not, these are unique for in the cannabis space. Some of these apply to other drug therapies, but not all of them. And then quickly, before we wrap up, I wanted to mention, talk a little bit more about botanical drugs and FDA review and approval of botanical drugs, and the final guidance that FDA has issued to help companies that are interested in submitting a drug application for drugs that are derived from botanical sources. So this is the FDA's definition of what constitutes a botanical drug. It includes vegetable material, including any kind of plant material, algae, fungi, any kind of combination thereof. It can come in various different kinds of dosage forms. And if the active ingredients, if to get to the active ingredient, there's not all fermentation, but most kinds of fermentation processes, or if the products are highly distilled, purified, or chemically modified, that would not be considered to be a botanical drug product. So some of the unique, so in terms of submitting an IND for botanical drugs, it's pretty much the same as the IND process that we described earlier. But there are certain unique characteristics that can impact the kind of information that a sponsor would need to submit to the FDA. Because plants are not as easily controllable as, compounds in a lab, the heterogeneity of the sources of the plant material and the potential variations in the active ingredients or the constituent elements of the plants are either difficult to identify or they're not very well characterized. It's not fully understood how the activities of those ingredients, how they act. So there's a lot of unique challenges that are present for botanical drugs that more chemical-based drugs don't have to deal with. And so those kinds of things would need to be addressed in the IND. And again, for companies that are interested in submitting an IND for kind of cannabis, for types of cannabis therapies or therapies derived from the cannabis plant, they'd be well served by meeting with FDA, reaching out to FDA early to understand what kinds of controls, chemistry, the CMC controls would need to be in place. So a few of the, I alluded to these in the last slide, but some of the unique challenges for botanical drugs, including cannabis derived therapies, because of the heterogeneity and potential uncertainty about the active constituents, there are certain controls that need to be put in place and kind of different solutions that companies need to identify before seeking FDA approval. And so FDA's position is that to ensure a consistent product across various batches and lots of the drugs, FDA has taken the position that it could be supported by a totality of the evidence. How's that for a legal standard? That kind of approach in terms of controlling the incoming raw botanical materials that are used to produce the product, certain kinds of manufacturing and processing controls that need to be in place in terms of the processing, as well as any sorts of the kinds of assays that are done to ensure the quality manufacturing of the product. So with that, I have just given a ton of different information about various different parts of FDA drug regulation and how it is can touch on the cannabis industry and how companies considering seeking FDA approval for cannabis-derived therapies, the things that they would need to know in doing so. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Emily, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on the Ask a Question drop-down box located on the far left of your presentation window. Type your question into the box that appears on your screen and click the Send button. We'll answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Let's get started. Our first question is, do you think the FDA will ever actually approve a non-synthetic cannabis drug?
I very rarely, as a lawyer, I very rarely get to give single word answers, but yes, I think they will. Currently, there is a pending orphan drug application, FDA, that has a goal approval or decision date of this summer, and it is a cannabidiol CBD product intended to treat childhood epilepsy. And that CBD is not manufactured in a lab. It is extracted from cannabis plants. And it's shown a lot of progress, or excuse me, a lot of promise. As I mentioned during my presentation, it takes a lot to get to even the NDA application stage. And so the fact that this drug is in the NDA stage and is pending approval from FDA seems like it will be likely to be approved this summer.
Well, thank you. We have time for one more question. How does the FDA determine a product's intended use, and what kinds of claims render a product a drug under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act?
Sure. So the product's intended use, FDA will look at all of the claims that are being made about a particular product. They will look at product websites. They will go to, if for example, a company links to another company or a chat board on their website, the FDA will look to that to see, are these things that are suggesting that the company marketing this product intends it to be used in a particular way? Because if a company has something on their website or links to something on their website, even testimonials made by customers, those can be seen as the intended use of the product. In terms of the kinds of claims that can, turn a product from not a drug into a drug, obviously the most kind of egregious example, or the most simple example, would be cures cancer or treats epilepsy or the like. But there are a wide range of types of products, like, for example, alleviating anxiety and things like that. PMS would be considered a disease for the purposes of determining a health claim. So it's really not just about cancer, Alzheimer's, and very, very serious things, but there are a lot of different kinds of conditions or ailments that you and I might not think of a disease, but could make a product, turn a product into a drug if you're saying that you're going to treat or help prevent that kind of condition.
Thank you for that. I would like to once again thank Emily Leongini for her presentation. I'd also like to thank LabRoots for making today's educational webcast possible. Before we go, I want to let everyone know that today's webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through June 29th, 2018. You'll receive an email from LabRoots letting you know when this webcast will be available for replay. Please share that announcement with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That is all for now. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.